That morning, my Ford F-150 was gone. So was every dollar I'd spent 43 years saving. Then my phone rang. You still cry over that mutt like he was your wife. Maybe you should have buried him in her spot, too. Save yourself a second headstone. Nobody in that kitchen moved. The refrigerator kept humming behind us, the same low sound it had made for 20 years, indifferent to what had just been said out loud. My daughter-in-law's coffee sat untouched on the counter, steam still curling off it. Derek didn't blink. He just watched me the way you'd watch a fence post you were deciding whether to finally knock down. Something that had been standing so long, holding up nothing that nobody would notice if it fell. If you're new here, I tell true stories about family, about the people who are supposed to love us the most, and about what it costs to finally stop pretending that isn't happening. Stay until the end. Some of you already know why. My name is Walter Reeves. I'm 63 years old, and for 38 years I ran the only veterinary clinic in Millbrook, Oregon. I delivered 1,140 foals in that time, gave away more free rabies shots to families who couldn't pay than I ever billed for, and drove 40 extra miles round trip, twice a week, for 9 straight years, just to check on a blind mare nobody else wanted to treat. My late wife Eleanor used to say I collected broken things because I couldn't stand to see anything left behind. She wasn't wrong. She was rarely wrong about me. Eleanor died 6 years ago this coming October. It was slow, the kind of slow that gives you time to say everything and somehow still leaves things unsaid. After the funeral, the house felt less like a home and more like a museum nobody visited. 3 months later, I drove out to the county shelter, walked past 40 cages, and stopped in front of a golden retriever with a gray muzzle and one ear that never stood upright. The volunteer told me he'd been surrendered twice already. I told her he wouldn't be surrendered a third time. I named him Duke because Eleanor always said our first dog, back when we were newlyweds with nothing, deserved a name too big for the tiny apartment we kept him in. Duke became the reason I got out of bed on the mornings. I didn't especially want to. That particular Thursday started like every other ones since I'd retired 4 years back. Coffee at 6:15, bird feeder refilled. Duke at my heel while I checked the tomatoes I'd never admit I overwater. It was the small routines that kept me upright most days, the way a splint keeps a bone from moving wrong while it heals. 3 days before that morning, Derek had shown up unannounced, which by itself wasn't unusual anymore, though it once would have been. He used to call first. He used to visit because he wanted to, not because he needed something. I try not to keep score of when that changed, but if I'm honest with myself, I remember the exact year. "Hey, Dad." He'd stood in my driveway with his hands in his jacket pockets, not quite looking at me. "I've got some equipment I need to store for a few weeks. Business stuff. Mind if I use the shed?" I told him, of course, like I always told him, of course. I gave him the code to the side gate and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I'd had garden cameras installed the year before, after somebody broke into 3 houses on our block. "Don't mind those," I'd said. "They just record to a hard drive in the garage. I barely check them." He'd nodded, glanced toward the corner of the eave where the small camera sat, and said something about how careful I'd gotten in my old age. I laughed. I actually laughed. I didn't know it yet, but I would spend the rest of that year wishing I'd looked at that footage the very next morning instead of trusting the way I always trusted, that my son wouldn't give me a reason to. The morning everything changed, I found Duke in the backyard before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. He wasn't at the door, waiting the way he always was. I called his name twice before I heard the sound, a low, wet, awful sound, like something laboring to work that had simply stopped wanting to. He was lying near the fence line, back legs splayed at an angle no healthy dog holds them at. Foam gathered pale and thick at the corner of his mouth. His eyes found mine, and I swear there was an apology in them. Like he was sorry for whatever was happening to his own body. Sorry he couldn't explain it to me. 38 years of practice doesn't leave you just because you've retired. My hands remembered before my mind caught up, pulse at the femoral, gums the color of old chalk, pupils blown wide and slow to react. I didn't need a diagnosis manual. I needed my truck keys, and I needed them now. I called ahead so Marcus, the young vet who bought my practice when I retired, would be ready at the door. He was. He and his tech had Duke on the table within 90 seconds of me, carrying him through the entrance, my back screaming from the weight, my knees not caring one bit that I was 63 years old and hadn't lifted anything that heavy in a decade, Walter. Marcus didn't look up from what he was doing. How long ago did this start? I don't know. I found him like this 20 minutes ago. Has he had access to antifreeze? Rat poison? Anything sweet tasting that's usually kept locked up? The question landed somewhere behind my ribs before I even understood why. My garage, I said slowly. I keep antifreeze on the shelf by the workbench. Has for years. Marcus's face told me everything before he said the words. This looks like ethylene glycol toxicity, Walter. Late stage. I need you to tell me exactly how much access he had to that garage in the last 48 hours. I stood there in a room I used to own, in a building I used to run, and felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. Not because I didn't understand the medicine. Because I understood it too well. By the time Marcus came out to the waiting room 3 hours later, I had already called animal control, already called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, already sat in a plastic chair running through in my head every single person who had been near that garage in the past week. There weren't many names on that list. There was, in fact, only one that mattered. He's stable, Marcus said, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding since sunrise. Barely. If you'd found him an hour later, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. He's got kidney damage. We won't know how permanent for a few days. He hesitated, the way people hesitate when they're about to say something they know will hurt. Walter, this wasn't an accident. The dose in his system, the way it was administered, somebody mixed antifreeze with something sweet. Ice cream, maybe, or syrup. Dogs don't accidentally lap up a lethal dose of coolant off a garage floor. Somebody fed this to him on purpose. I made myself a promise standing in that waiting room. The linoleum floor, the same one I'd walked across 10,000 times in my working life. I promised myself that by the anniversary of Eleanor's death, 17 days away, I would know with absolute certainty who had done this to the last living thing that made an empty house feel less empty. I didn't know yet how close to home that answer would sit. I didn't know I would spend those 17 days learning things about my own son that I would have given almost anything not to know. I drove home in silence, Duke's leash still looped over my wrist out of habit, my hands not quite steady on the wheel. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long moment before going inside, staring at the little camera mounted under the eave, the one I'd told Derek not to worry about, the one I hadn't checked in months, because I trusted the people who came through my gate. That trust had cost me something already. I just didn't know yet how much more it was about to cost. Inside, the house was too quiet without Duke's nails clicking across the kitchen floor. I made coffee I didn't drink and sat down at the same dining table where Eleanor and I had once spread out Derek's college applications, hospital bills after his first car accident, and every other paper that had ever mattered in this family. Some habits outlive the people who started them. I thought about the week before, replaying it slower this time. Derek's visit, the shed, the mention of business equipment he never actually brought over. I realize that now, sitting there, I'd never actually seen any boxes go into that shed. I'd assumed, I'd trusted. Two things a father does so easily, they stop feeling like choices at all. I also thought about the antifreeze jug on my garage shelf, the one I'd noticed a few days earlier sitting lower than I remembered, the cap slightly loose. I'd told myself I must have used more than I thought last winter, topping off the old truck's radiator. I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? A man doesn't suspect his own son of counting inventory in a garage. Derek was 34 years old. He had a business he called consulting, though I'd never been entirely clear on what he consulted about, and a girlfriend named Brianna who had appeared in his life about a year and a half earlier with the sudden, complete thoroughness of a weather system moving in. She talked in a way that made you feel, for the first 10 minutes, smarter and more important than you actually were. It took longer to notice that every conversation somehow circled back to money. Whose money, how much, and when it might become available. 6 months before that Thursday, Derek had asked me to co-sign a business loan. I'd said I needed to think about it. 4 months before that Thursday, he'd asked again, this time mentioning that Brianna's company, something called Pure Root Wellness, needed collateral to secure a larger line of credit, and that my clinic property, sold years ago but the land itself still legally mine, leased back to Marcus, would qualify. I'd told him no, not out of spite, out of a lesson I'd learned the hard way years earlier, that I hadn't told this story about yet. When Derek was 26, deep in gambling debt he hadn't told me about, he forged my signature on a $4,000 check from our joint household account. I found out from the bank, not from him. I never pressed charges. I paid it quietly and told myself it was a one-time mistake born out of desperation, the kind young men sometimes make and then spend the rest of their lives regretting. I see now that my silence wasn't kindness. It was cowardice dressed up as love. I should have set a boundary that day instead of writing a check and pretending it hadn't happened. I've had a long time to sit with that mistake, and I'll come back to it because it matters more than I understood at the time. After that forgery, an attorney named Diane Foss, an old friend of Eleanor's from her hospital volunteer days, sat me down at this same dining table and told me something I've never forgotten. She'd said, folding her hands the way people do when they're about to say something you don't want to hear, your greatest financial risk isn't a stranger walking through your door. It's someone who already has a key. She helped me move the house and the clinic land into an irrevocable trust with an independent trustee, not Derek, not a friend, a licensed professional whose only job was following the paperwork exactly as written, not to punish my son, to protect him from ever being able to do something that couldn't be undone, and to protect what Eleanor and I had built for 40 years from a single desperate night. I told myself, sitting there with cold coffee in front of me, that the trust had been enough, that I'd handled it. I hadn't considered, until Duke lay foaming at the mouth in my backyard, that some people don't stop finding new doors to try, just because you've locked the one they already tried once. My phone rang at 9:40 that night. I almost didn't answer it. Ever since the call that told me Eleanor had taken a turn for the worse, the one that came at 11 at night 4 years ago and changed the shape of the rest of my life in about 40 seconds, I've had trouble picking up the phone after dark. My hand actually hovers over it sometimes, 2-3 rings, like some part of me is still negotiating with whatever news is waiting on the other end. Eleanor used to tease me for checking the caller ID twice, before answering, even in daylight. She'd have laughed gently at how much worse it got after she was gone. I made myself pick it up on the 4th ring. It was Sam Whitfield, my closest friend since high school, a retired Oregon State police trooper who'd spent 30 years working roads I used to drive every week hauling feed and medical supplies. Sam has a way of knowing when something's wrong before you've said a single word. You sound off. He said, no hello, no small talk. That was Sam. Duke's at the clinic. Somebody poisoned him. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he finally said. Don't touch anything in that garage until I get there. He didn't ask who I suspected. I think, even then, some part of him already knew the answer, the same way some part of me did, the part I hadn't let myself listen to yet. Sam arrived closer to 15 minutes than 20, his old green pickup rattling into my driveway the same way it had for decades. He didn't hug me. Sam and I have shaken hands at every reunion, every funeral, every fishing trip for 40 years, and never once embraced like men who needed to. But that night, standing in my kitchen with my dog's blood pressure number still echoing in my head, he pulled me into a rough, wordless embrace that lasted only a few seconds and said more than either of us could have managed out loud. Neither of us mentioned it afterward. Some things don't need mentioning to matter. Walk me through it, he said instead, releasing me and reaching for the coffee pot like he'd lived in this kitchen half his life, which in a way he had. I told him everything. The shed, the camera code, the antifreeze jug sitting lower than I remembered, the loan Derek wanted co-signed, Brianna's company needing collateral. Sam listened the way he used to listen to accident reports at the side of the highway, quiet, absorbing every detail, filing it somewhere he could pull it back out later, exact and unchanged. You still have those camera recordings? He asked when I finished. I hadn't thought of it in those exact terms until he said it out loud. The cameras, the ones I'd told Derek not to worry about, the ones that had been quietly recording everything in that backyard for a year and a half, indifferent to who walked through the gate or what they carried in their hands. They saved to a hard drive in the garage, I said slowly. 30-day rolling storage. I haven't looked at any of it in months. Sam set his coffee down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when he doesn't trust his hands not to slam it. Then I think it's time we looked. I didn't know it yet, but somewhere on that hard drive, time-stamped and unforgiving, was a version of my son I had spent 34 years refusing to imagine existed. I almost deleted the footage without watching it, that first night, telling myself I didn't have the stomach for it, that whatever was on there could wait until morning, and Sam wouldn't let me. He sat beside me at the workbench while I plugged in the small monitor I used to review the recordings, scrolled back 3 nights and pressed play. I want to tell you what I saw. I will. But first you should understand what came before it. Because none of what happened in that garage makes sense without knowing exactly how far my son had already fallen before he ever touched that jug of antifreeze, and how much of that fall, I would come to learn, wasn't entirely his own doing. 2 nights before that footage, in the timeline I'd eventually reconstruct with Detective Ibarra's help, Brianna Cole had sat across from Derek at their kitchen table, with a laptop open between them and a stack of overdue notices from a private lender neither of us had ever heard of. I wasn't there for that conversation. I only know what came out later, in pieces, some from Derek himself, once he had no more pieces left to hide, some from a woman named Carla Whitmore, who used to work as Brianna's bookkeeper before she quit in disgust 8 months earlier, and kept, out of what she'd later call a bad feeling I couldn't shake, copies of emails she was never supposed to keep. Pure Root Wellness wasn't the modest supplement startup Derek had described to me at my own dinner table. By the time Carla walked away from it, the company owed just under $200,000 to a private lending group that didn't send polite letters when payments were late. Brianna had personally guaranteed part of that debt using an inheritance from her grandmother that, according to Carla, had never actually existed in the amount claimed. The company was, in the plainest words I can put to it, running out of road, and Brianna needed collateral that didn't belong to her fast enough to keep the lender from calling the whole balance due. That's where I came in. Not as a father anymore, in her eyes. As an asset, Derek has since told me, in a version I believe because it cost him something to admit it, that the first time Brianna suggested making the old man understand what's really at stake, by doing something to Duke, he told her no. He told her absolutely not. That I'd already lost enough. That the dog was the only thing standing between me and an empty house some mornings. I believe that part of him meant it. I have to believe it. Or I don't know how I keep loving what's left of my son. What I also believe, because the messages Carla eventually handed to Detective Ibarra don't leave much room for another reading, is that Brianna didn't ask twice. She waited. She brought it up again 3 days later, differently. Not hurt the dog. Just make him sick enough that your father finally understands how serious this is, enough that he has to choose between that mutt's vet bills and helping his own son. She framed it, according to those messages, as something almost merciful, a wake-up call, not a cruelty. I don't know what Derek told himself in the hours before he walked into my garage with the code I'd given him myself, but I know what he did. Because the camera doesn't lie the way people do. The footage timestamp read 11:47 p.m., grainy green-tinted night vision, the kind that makes even familiar shapes look like something out of a stranger's memory. My own son, moving low along the fence line toward Duke's outdoor water bowl, a small container in his other hand. He crouched, he poured, he stood there a moment, longer than made sense for someone in a hurry, and I watched my boy, because in that moment, watching that grainy footage with Sam's hand heavy and still on my shoulder, that's exactly what he still was to me. My boy pressed the back of his wrist against his own mouth like he might be sick. Then the audio, tinny and distant from the camera's built-in microphone, caught something I will hear for the rest of my life. He wasn't talking to the dog. He was talking to himself, or maybe to Brianna, on speakerphone in his pocket, low enough that I had to turn the volume up twice to make out the words. I did it. I'm not doing this again. Tell her I did it and it's done. I didn't know it yet, but that sentence, I'm not doing this again, would end up mattering almost as much as the crime itself, in ways I couldn't have predicted sitting in my garage at midnight, with my hands shaking too hard to hold my coffee mug steady. Sam didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he reached over and paused the recording, freezing my son's face mid-flinch on the small screen. "Walter," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you just watched is enough. It's enough for a report tonight. It's enough for an arrest. You don't have to sit here and relive it a second time to be sure of what you saw." "I need to know why," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Not if, why. Sam nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer from me, like he'd have wanted the same thing in my position. "Then we do this the right way. Detective first. Not a confrontation in your kitchen at midnight." I called the sheriff's non-emergency line the next morning, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Detective Maria Ibarra was sitting across from me at my own dining room table, the fourth investigator to sit in that chair over the years, and by far the most careful about how she asked her questions. She worked out of a small joint unit that handled animal cruelty cases alongside financial fraud, which she explained, almost apologetically, tended to overlap more often than people expected. "Money and cruelty travel together, more than anyone likes to admit," she told me, opening a slim notebook. "People don't usually hurt an animal for no reason. There's almost always something they're trying to make someone else feel." I gave her the hard drive. I gave her Marcus's clinical notes from Duke's admission. I told her about the loan requests, about Brianna, about the missing level of antifreeze in a jug I'd owned for years and never bothered to measure until it mattered. She wrote all of it down without once looking at me, like I was something to be pitied, which I appreciated more than I could have explained to her in that moment. "Here's what I need you to understand, Mr. Reeves," she said, closing her notebook. "The video gives us probable cause for animal cruelty charges against your son. That part's straightforward. The financial piece is more complicated, and I need to be careful about how we build it, because I'm not going to hand a defense attorney an excuse to throw out good evidence by cutting corners now." She explained, patiently, that anything involving Pureroot's internal finances would need to come from legitimate sources, bank records obtained properly, documents Carla Whitmore had voluntarily kept and was willing to hand over, filings already public through the state's business registry. "We don't go digging through anyone's private accounts without a warrant," she said. "Not even to catch someone who deserves it. Especially not then." I hadn't fully appreciated, until she explained it that plainly, how much I'd wanted a shortcut. Some part of me had wanted her to walk into Brianna's bank the next morning and pull every number that would prove what I already believed in my gut. Maria, rather, I keep her confused in my memory with someone else from another hard year, reminded me, gently but firmly, that doing this the right way was the only way it would actually hold. 2 days passed with no word from Derek. I found out later that Detective Ibarra had made a deliberate choice to hold off contacting him directly, wanting the financial pieces from Carla Whitmore in hand first, so that when they did speak to him, he wouldn't have room to talk his way around what the camera had already shown. I spent those 2 days at the clinic with Duke, who was improving slowly, his kidney values coming down a little more each morning, though Marcus was careful never to promise me a full recovery. I spent the nights at my dining table with Diane Foss, going over the trust documents Eleanor and I had built years earlier, documents that suddenly mattered in a way I'd hoped they never would. "Your authority hasn't changed," Diane told me, spreading the paperwork across the same table where Derek had once done algebra homework. "You're still the grantor. As trustee, I can amend the distribution terms whenever the trust document allows it, which yours does, specifically in the case of conduct that constitutes a felony against you or your property." She looked up at me over her glasses, the same look she'd given me 8 years earlier. "This isn't about disinheriting your son out of anger, Walter. I won't help you do that. It's about deciding, with a clear head, what he's actually entitled to going forward, and making sure he's properly and formally notified of any change in writing, so there's no confusion later about what happened and why. I sat with that for a long moment. Somewhere in me, the father who'd once carried a screaming toddler through 3 emergency rooms in one bad winter still wanted to find version of this where none of it needed to happen at all. But I thought about Duke's eyes in that backyard, the apology in them for something that wasn't his fault, and I thought about the words on that recording, "I'm not doing this again," and I told Diane to draft the amendment. "One more thing," she said, before I could stand up from the table. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn cardboard box. I recognized instantly. One Eleanor had kept on the top shelf of our bedroom closet for as long as I could remember, labeled in her looping handwriting simply, "For later, if needed." "You gave this to me for safekeeping the year Derek forged that check, Walter. You asked me to hold on to it and only bring it back if things ever got bad again. I think it's time." My hands weren't entirely steady when I opened it that night. Alone, Duke's empty dog bed still sitting in the corner of the living room where he usually slept. Inside was a single sealed envelope in Eleanor's handwriting, and beneath it, an old dented metal dog bowl. The word Duke, painted crookedly across the rim in a color that had long since faded. Not our Duke, but the first one, the puppy we'd raised together in that tiny apartment, before either of us had a dime to our name. She'd kept it all these years. I hadn't even known the letter wasn't long. Eleanor was never one for long letters. She said, if you needed more than a page to say something true, you probably didn't understand it well enough yourself yet. "I worry sometimes," she'd written, "that our boy has never learned the difference between being loved and being allowed to get away with things. I don't think he's cruel, Walter. I think he's frightened of not being enough. And frightened people sometimes do things that look cruel because it's easier than admitting they're scared. Don't let your love for him turn into a door he thinks he can walk through, no matter what he does on the other side of it. Love him with your whole heart, but make sure he knows the heart has a lock on it too." I sat with that letter for a long time. She hadn't predicted any of this specifically. She couldn't have, and reading it, I understood she wasn't trying to. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a mother's plain, ordinary worry, written years before any of it happened, true in the general way that turns out, sometimes, to be truer than anything specific could have been. 3 days later, Detective Ibarra called to tell me Carla Whitmore had come forward with everything, the emails, the loan documents, records of the calls between Brianna and the lending group that made it clear exactly how desperate Pure Root's finances had become in the weeks before Duke was poisoned. "We're ready to bring both of them in for questioning," she told me. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it happens, because I know this is still your son, no matter what he's done." "When?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "There's a community event this Saturday. The Animal Shelter fundraiser. I understand it's named after your late wife." I hadn't mentioned that to her. I don't know how she knew, except that a good detective in a small town tends to know more about the people involved in her cases than she lets on at first. The Eleanor Reeves Memorial Adoption Day had been running for 5 years, ever since a group of Eleanor's old hospital volunteer friends decided the animal shelter she'd spent her last healthy years supporting deserved her name on something permanent. Derek and Brianna were expected there. So was I. So, as it turned out, would half the county. "I'd rather not stage anything in front of a crowd of grieving strangers and children," Ibarra said carefully. "But if your son is going to be there regardless, I think it makes sense for us to be present too. Quietly. Whatever happens after that will happen because of what he does, not because we forced a scene." I didn't sleep well the 2 nights before that Saturday. I kept thinking about the little bowl with Duke painted on the rim, about a puppy neither Derek nor I had ever met, about Eleanor's handwriting warning me, decades before any of this, that love needed a lock on it sometimes. I thought about the check I'd quietly paid off 8 years ago and the boundary I never set, and I understood, finally, sitting alone in a house too quiet without a dog's nails on the floor, that some part of this had started long before that garage, long before Brianna, on a night when a younger, more frightened version of my son learned that his father would always find a way to make his mistakes disappear without cost. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. Whatever happened on Saturday, Derek was finally going to have to stand in the consequences of his own choices, in daylight, in front of the people who actually loved him, and find out, once and for all, whether love without a lock had ever really protected him at all, or whether it had just kept him from ever learning to protect himself. Saturday arrived clear and unseasonably warm for late September, the kind of morning Eleanor always said the county didn't deserve and got anyway. The shelter grounds were already crowded by 9, tables set up under blue canopies, a line of dogs on leashes waiting to meet their new families, a banner strung between 2 fence posts reading the Eleanor Reeves Memorial at Eruption Day in letters she never got to see but would have pretended to be embarrassed by. I arrived with Duke, who was 3 weeks out from the poisoning and still thinner than he should have been, his energy returning in small, stubborn increments. Marcus assured me were exactly right for a dog. His age recovering from what he'd been through. Sam walked beside me, close enough that I understood without either of us saying anything that he wasn't planning to leave my side all day. Derek was already there when I arrived, standing near the registration table with Brianna, both of them dressed like people who'd rehearsed looking comfortable somewhere they didn't quite belong. He saw Duke first. I watched something cross his face. I want to say it was relief, though I've had a long time since to wonder if I only wanted to see relief, because the alternative was harder to carry. "He's doing okay?" Derek asked, and for one unguarded second, he sounded exactly like the 8-year-old who used to bring home injured birds from the schoolyard, convinced I could fix anything if he brought it to me fast enough. "He's alive," I said. No thanks to whoever poured antifreeze into his water bowl. Brianna's expression didn't change, but her hand found Derek's forearm, light and quick, the kind of touch that isn't affection so much as a leash. "That's a horrible thing to have happened, Walter," she said smoothly. "Do they know who did it?" "Probably kids this time of year. There's a whole pack of them that cuts through backyards on this side of town." I didn't answer her. I was watching Derek, and Derek was not watching her hand on his arm, or me, or anything at all. He was watching a small girl, maybe 8 years old, walking toward us from the direction of the puppy pen, her hand raised in a wave. Sophia was Derek's daughter from a relationship that had ended before Brianna, a bright, watchful child I saw maybe 6 or 7 times a year, usually at my initiative rather than her father's. She ran the last few steps and threw her arms around Duke's neck with the fearless enthusiasm of a kid who has never once considered that a dog might not want to be hugged. "Grandpa says Duke was really sick," she said, looking up at Derek. "Not me. Daddy, what happened to him?" I have relived what happened in the next 10 seconds more times than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. Derek opened his mouth to answer his daughter with something easy. Something adults say to children to end a conversation quickly. "An accident, sweetheart, dogs get sick sometimes." And I watched the lie fail to form. I watched him look at Sophia's open, trusting face, the same face Eleanor used to say Derek had worn at that exact age, and I watched something in him simply give out like a fence post finally going down after years of standing on rot. "I did it," he said. "Not to me. Not to Brianna." To his daughter, in a voice that cracked in the middle of 3 words. "I hurt him, Sophia. I did something really bad, and I don't know how to make it right." The words carried further than he intended, in the way words do when a crowd goes quiet around them without meaning to. A few heads turned, Brianna's hand tightened on his arm, and this time it wasn't subtle at all. "Derek," she said, low and sharp, "don't do this here." "Why not?" His voice was rising now, something coming loose that had clearly been wound too tight for weeks. "You said it would just make him sick. You said it would just be a wake-up call. You didn't tell me how it would feel to watch him lying there and know I did that." He turned to me, and I saw, for the first time in longer than I could remember, my son's eyes fill with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "Dad, I'm not doing this again. I told her that night, I'm done, and I meant it, but I should have never started. I should have told you what she was asking me to do the second she asked it." Sophia had gone very still, her small arms still around Duke's neck, looking between her father and her grandfather, with the particular seriousness only children manage. The seriousness of someone trying to fit an adult-sized truth into a heart that isn't built for it yet. "Daddy," she said finally, quiet enough that only the people closest to us could hear, "if you didn't want Duke around anymore, why didn't you just say so instead of hurting him?" Nobody answered her. Nobody could have answered her, because there wasn't an answer that made any of it make sense to an 8-year-old, or, if I'm honest, to a 63-year-old either. That was when I noticed Sam had quietly stepped a few feet back, and following his gaze, I saw Detective Ibarra and a uniformed deputy moving through the crowd toward us, unhurried, deliberately calm, the way you approach something you don't want to startle into running. Brianna saw them too. Whatever composure she'd been holding onto broke apart at roughly the same speed Derek's had, though for entirely different reasons. "This is a private family matter," she said, backing half a step away from Derek, as though putting distance between them now might undo the last several weeks. "Whatever he's confessing to, I had nothing to do with any of it. Ims Cole." Ibarra's voice was even professional, carrying just far enough. "We have text messages between you and Mr. Reeves dating back 6 weeks discussing his father's dog. We also have voluntary statements from a former employee of Pure Root Wellness regarding the state of your company's finances leading up to that conversation. I'd like you to come speak with us. I want to tell you," the crowd gasped, that there was some dramatic collective intake of breath, but that's not how it happened. What actually happened was quieter, and somehow worse. People simply went still, the way that Kitchen had gone still weeks earlier. A low murmur passing backward through the gathering like something being confirmed rather than discovered. A woman near the registration table, someone I recognized as a longtime volunteer who'd known Eleanor for years, stepped forward without being asked and put a hand on my shoulder. "Whatever's happening, Walter," she said, "we're not going anywhere." I looked past her and realized she wasn't alone. A dozen people I'd quietly helped over the years, families I'd treated animals for free when they couldn't pay, a rancher whose whole herd I'd vaccinated one bad winter for nothing but gas money, had drifted closer, not making a scene, just standing there, present the way people stand at a funeral when words would only get in the way. Dorek didn't run. I want that on the record, because it's the one thing that day that gave me something to hold on to in the weeks that followed. He stood exactly where he was, Sophia still holding tight to Duke, and he looked at Ibarra and said, "I'll come. Just, can I have a minute with my dad first?" Ibarra glanced at me. I nodded. He didn't say much in that minute. He said he was sorry, the kind of sorry that isn't trying to fix anything, just trying to be honest about how small it felt against what he'd done. He said Brianna had told him, over and over, that it was the only way to make me understand how serious their financial trouble was, that I'd never take his problems seriously otherwise, that this was the fastest way to force my hand. He said somewhere in the last 3 weeks, watching me carry Duke into that clinic, on the security footage he made himself watch twice, he'd finally understood that he'd been looking for a shortcut around becoming a person capable of solving his own problems, and that he'd used me, the way you use something you've never really had to think of as breakable, to get there. "I should have told you no the second she asked," he said. "Not just not doing it twice, no, the first time. I keep thinking about what Mom would say. I thought about the letter in that cardboard box, about a lock on a heart that still, even now, hadn't fully closed. She'd say she was scared of exactly this," I told him. "She wrote it down once. Years ago. He didn't ask to see it. Not that day. That would come later, on its own time." Diane Foss met us at Ibarra's office 2 hours after that. Once the formal statements had been taken, once Brianna had been read her rights on charges that would eventually include felony, conspiracy, and financial fraud, once Derek had been charged with animal cruelty and, because of his cooperation and the note the prosecutor's office would later find in his truck cab, a torn scrap of paper with 3 words scrawled on it in his own handwriting, "Get rid of problem," dated the day before the poisoning, evidence he never once tried to hide, once asked for it directly. A lesser charge than it might have been. The paperwork with Diane was quiet, almost anticlimactic after everything else. She explained it to Derek plainly, the way she'd explained it to me weeks earlier. "Your father isn't disinheriting you out of spite, Derek. He's formally notifying you, in writing, that the terms of the trust have been amended to reflect what happened. You're not signing away anything that was ever legally yours to begin with. You're signing to acknowledge you've been properly informed of the change and agreeing not to contest it later. Derek read every page. He asked one question, whether Sophia's college fund, set up years ago separately and untouched by any of this, was still intact. Diane confirmed it was. He signed without arguing a single line. I don't deserve for it to still be there for her, he said quietly, sliding the pen back across the table. No, I told him. But she does, and that's not really about you anymore. 2 months passed before I let myself believe Duke was actually going to be fine. His kidney values came back into normal range in November, and Marcus cleared him for the kind of long, slow walks that used to be the best part of my day and had quietly become the best part of it again. Brianna Cole pled guilty in December to felony conspiracy and financial fraud. The plea deal built almost entirely on Carla Whitmore's voluntarily surrendered records and her own text messages, none of it obtained by anyone breaking a single rule to get it. She received a prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution neither Pure Root Wellness nor its remaining creditors would likely ever fully collect. Derek's case moved differently, a plea to a lesser cruelty charge, given his cooperation, a sentence of probation, mandatory counseling, and 400 hours of community service, which the judge almost pointedly suggested he complete at an animal shelter. He chose the one with his mother's name on it. I didn't visit him much those first few weeks after everything became final. Trust doesn't grow back on a schedule, and I've learned not to force it faster than it's ready to move. But he showed up every single Saturday, cleaning kennels and walking dogs nobody else wanted to walk, and slowly, without either of us discussing it directly, I started showing up on Saturdays too. In March, the shelter board decided to dedicate a new intake wing, funded partly by community donations that had poured in, unexpectedly after word got around about what had happened to Duke. They wanted to name it after him. I told them that felt like too much for a dog who'd simply had the bad luck of being loved by the wrong family's problems. They named it after him anyway. At the small dedication ceremony that spring, Sophia stood at the front with a pair of scissors too big for her hands, ready to cut a ribbon strung across the new entrance. Derek stood beside her, off to the side, still wearing the particular carefulness of a man learning to take up less space than he used to assume was his by right. When the ribbon was cut and the small crowd applauded, Sophia turned and looked for me specifically, not her father, and asked, in the plain, direct way children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding, "Grandpa, are you and Daddy okay now?" I looked at Derek. He was watching me with the same unguarded expression I'd seen in my driveway all those months ago. Before any of this, before I understood what unspoken things had been sitting underneath his life the whole time. "We're working on it," I told her, and it was the truest answer I had. That's usually how okay actually happens. Nobody just wakes up there. Later that afternoon, once most of the crowd had thinned out, Derek found me sitting on a bench near Duke's new wing. Duke himself dozing at my feet in a patch of sun. He sat down without asking, which felt in its small way like its own kind of progress. "I keep thinking about something Mom wrote," he said. "The thing you told me about. The lock on the heart. You never asked to read it. I'm asking now." I gave it to him that evening, the actual letter, not a description of it. I watched him read it twice, slowly, his jaw working the way mine had the night I first opened that box. When he finished, he folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back like something he understood he hadn't earned the right to keep yet. Maybe wouldn't for a long time. "I spent 34 years thinking love meant you'd always find a way to fix whatever I broke," he said. "I don't think I understood until this year that the fixing was never supposed to be free." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else he's said to me since. Because he was right, and because I was the one who taught him it might be free quietly. Every time I paid off a check or looked past something I should have named out loud. Eleanor tried to warn me. I wasn't ready to hear it until a dog nearly died, proving her right. Duke turned 8 that August, gray around the muzzle a little further than he'd been the year before, slower on our walks, but still first at the door most mornings, still leaning his full weight against my leg while I make coffee, the way he's done since the day I brought him home from a shelter with 40 other cages I couldn't save. Some mornings I still find myself talking quietly to an empty chair on the back porch before the Cardinals arrive, the same habit I've kept since Eleanor died, and some mornings lately, Derek's chair beside it isn't empty anymore. He comes by most Sundays now. We don't talk about all of it every time. Some Sundays we just drink coffee and watch the birds, which Eleanor always said was its own kind of conversation, if you let it be. I used to believe that loving someone meant never letting them face the full weight of what they'd done. I know better now. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is step back and let his child stand, alone, in the consequences he spent a lifetime shielding him from. Not because the love runs out, but because it finally grows into something strong enough to survive the truth. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you'd move mountains for, I hope you know it doesn't mean the love was smaller. Sometimes it just means it finally grew up.